Okay. So tell me about your early childhood and what you remember about it.
Well, not too much, but of course I've heard the stories. Actually, I was born in Hust, which is now part of Ukraine, but then, of course, and for many thousands of for 1,000+ years was part of Hungary. But we moved. We didn't stay there long, and when we left Hungary, our point of departure was Mandok. It's a town in eastern Hungary, Mandok, Mandok, and we were essentially fleeing from the advancing Russian army. We didn't know what the outcome would be. It was a matter of just getting out of harm's way. This is, of course, something that my parents told me because I was only 5 years old. It was fall, October, I think, of 1944, and it was the spring of 1945 that we actually crossed the Hungarian-Austrian border and eventually went into Germany, to Bavaria, and there are some memories there. We lived on a farm, some very nice German farmers. The Bauern, her husband was quite ill with cancer, and my father still had some medicine so he could treat her. And he actually treated some of the farmers around there because there was no medical assistance and some of the routes were still mined, so traveling was not an option. And us and my mother and my aunt, my mother's sister, who was with us, lived on a farm there, and my father was working in a UN hospital in Passau. And when that closed, he got a job in a Polish refugee camp in Koblenz in the Rhineland, and then later we went to also a Polish refugee camp in Trier, also in the Rhineland. And there my memories are much better, but we were quite lucky because the refugee camps in most instances were either old military barracks, sometimes quite flimsy and not too well equipped, sometimes old castles, which was all right, but very often it meant that people had to, 5, 10 families were in one huge room with just blankets or sheets separating them. We always had, we were in a farm once, and with the farmers we had a room, and we had a garden and so on. And then when my father was a doctor at the Polish camps, as the doctor we got a nice apartment, so anyway, we were better off than most people. And of course, after World War II, Germany had a lot of refugees, and immigration to Australia and South America, I think, started in 48 or 49, I'm not sure, but it started before immigration to the US was a possibility. So 5 years, essentially, 4 or 5 years, 6 years, people had to wait. And we came to the States in 1950, early 1950.
So how did your parents finally come to the United States with you?
All right. Well, when immigration to the United States became possible, there were various organizations. Offices were set up, things were processed, and various organizations that connected prospective immigrants with associations or groups or whatever willing to sponsor them. At that time, you had to have a sponsor to come to the States, and the sponsor had to attest that they had a job and housing and so on for whoever they were sponsoring. And I think there was a certain amount of time that they were responsible for you in order to let people get settled and start becoming independent. And our sponsor was, the group was the National Catholic Welfare Organization, and our sponsor was a Catholic hospital run by the missionary servants of the Blessed Trinity in Gadsden, Alabama. So we went to Gadsden, Alabama first. So we left, most of the ships left from Bremerhaven. And again, there was a camp there, everyone collected, processed, etc., etc. The day before we were supposed to sail, my older sister developed measles. So my father and my aunt went on, sailed as scheduled because, you had the job, so just be on the safe side. Of course, we couldn't go, and my mother stayed with us because within days everyone in the camp came down with measles. So we left Bremerhaven, and we went to New Orleans. That was our port, not Ellis Island, New Orleans, because we were going to the south. And ships, these were U.S. Troop transport ships, big ships, with like 500 to a stateroom, not the stateroom, to a enclosure, just like you would have for soldiers, practical but not luxury. And the trip, I think it was about 2 weeks, because these weren't super fast, and of course we were going to New Orleans, and the trips to New Orleans only left like every month, I think. So we arrived in January, as opposed to my father and aunt were in the States in December, but we didn't arrive until January. But these were the roll of the dice. I do remember crossing. Like I said, my father and my aunt crossed separately a month before we did. My mother was sick most of the time, seasick most of the time. I was seasick for one day, and I slept through most of it. This was in the English Channel. Once we got into, I think it was the Azores that we left, and after that it was nice and sunny, and of course it took a while to go around the Florida panhandle. And by that time, and they showed movies on the deck, and so we were having fun. And you had asked about language. Of course, I started school in Germany, so I was fluent in German. We just picked that up. I mean, I don't remember learning it, but by the time I started school, we had been speaking German with all the, our landlord and everyone around. And then, of course, we started learning English, which actually, again, no formal classes or anything, but just from hearing it and with the kids and the people in the hospital. And I started school in February 1st, I think, is when I think it was even the start of a second semester. And I don't remember learning English, but in May, the regional supervisor for the Catholic schools came around, and she said I should be teaching the rest of the kids grammar, because my grammar was much better, having already learned Hungarian grammar and German grammar, and a bit of French grammar. At one of the camps, the Polish camps, we went to a Polish school, and there was a very nice teacher who also taught French, but that was only a couple of months. Nothing of that French remained, but I had some sort of grammatical background that exceeded that of my American classmates.
What grade level did you come in at?
Well, I was in the 4th grade in Germany, but Americans have this idea that for some unfathomable reason, they like to put people back a grade, figuring it's easier. Well, that's a lot of hogwash, quite frankly. And when I was in Raleigh already, by that time in '56, I was a teenager, and I was asked to help as a translator enroll some refugee kids, and the same thing happened, and I tried to argue against it, but arguing with school bored people is impossible. But anyway, I made up that last year later on, but I was put in the 3rd grade and quite frankly bored stiff.
How would you say your skills were in connection to the other students in your class when you first got here?
Well, first of all, a little bit of background. This was a very small Catholic school in Alabama where there aren't a lot of Catholics. So the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade were in one room, which meant, of course, that the teacher would do math with one and you were doing something else and someone else was doing something else. And I was put back a grade on this stupid idea that if people who don't know English will do better if they're put back a grade. But by very soon, first of all, it was I forget the readers, but the reading book that we read and that I learned my English reading from was the Dick and Jane series. And of course I was bored out of my head after the 2nd page when the same words kept being repeated. In a way, of course, it meant that I was learning everything because it was repetition. And I did learn English painlessly. But I must say, I'm glad I could make up that last year, but much of the time I was bored because I was really behind the grade was behind my qualifications.
So you were in 4th grade here.
Yes.
And you would have maybe have been in 5th grade.
Well, no, I was in 3rd. I should have been in 4th. I was in
grade.
3rd.
You're in 3rd. Yeah. And they were still giving you the Dick and Jane series,
yes.
which is for little kids, very little kids.
Well, no, not for 3rd grade. I mean, American schools don't teach much. I mean, nowadays I guess children learn something in kindergarten, but then kindergarten wasn't really much of a. I mean, there were very few kindergartens, and so they started learning in 1st grade. And I guess probably never got beyond the alphabet. I don't know what they did in 1st grade, but we were still reading. And I don't remember what we did in 4th and 5th grade. That was more, I was more in, anyway, it was more advanced. But the 3rd grade, when I started, it was half a year that I did.
So what happened after Alabama?
Okay, we were in Alabama maybe for 2.5 years or less, I don't know exactly. And then my father got a better job offer in Oklahoma. And of course, he also felt that he fulfilled his obligation to a sponsor, but moving is a good idea because there's always a different relationship. So we went to Oklahoma and then eventually Virginia and finally North Carolina. By that time, my father had his state board, and my mother did too. When we were moved to Ohio, and that's where they finally settled. Although by that time I was in high school.
So, did your parents talk to you about your earlier heritage?
Well, yes, of course, and we spoke Hungarian at home. Though after a while, we, among ourselves, I and my 2 sisters tended to speak English, speak English in school all day, and everything around us was English. And also sort of a Hunglish at home, because but our parents spoke English to us, and we understood Hungarian perfectly, but didn't speak Hungarian at the level. In other words, it was sort of an arrest that there were no other Hungarians, there was no scouting, there were no children, maybe some friends of my parents who were adults and or even older than my parents, and so there wasn't much conversation outside, Hungarian conversation outside the family. But actually, one thing, I remember when we first arrived in Alabama, my father had taken some English classes before we came, and he would read like Treasure Island and translate. So this was sort of a formal English learning experience. But that was about the only formal English learning experience I had, because most of it came from the schools. But in 1956, a cousin came out, and he alerted us to the fact that we were speaking a mixture of English and Hungarian, and that he couldn't understand all of what we said. So my older sister organized a summer school for us, and we studied literature, history, wrote essays. My mother corrected them. We learned poems. And we consciously started to use Hungarian to our parents. In other words, we stopped this business of being lazy, and we were able to recapture Hungarian fluency.
So the summer school was in Hungarian, to learn Hungarian.
Well, she organized it because, like I said, there were no other Hungarians around. But yeah, not to learn Hungarian, but also history, geography, literature, learn poems. There was some of the textbooks my aunt had sent us from Hungary. She was a teacher, and some were textbooks that had been used in Germany by the Hungarian schools there. So.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your, getting into higher education in this country.
Okay, yeah. All right. Well, I mean, it was a given that we'd all go to college, of course, and my sister went to Trinity College in Washington, D.C., which is a Catholic girls' school, Sisters of Notre Dame, and I looked at several others, but ended up there too. And I liked it there, and got a degree in English, but I was interested in literature. So for my graduate work, I did that in comparative literature, so I have a PhD in that. And I did some teaching and some publications. I still do publications.
Which comparative literature, may I ask?
What do you mean, which comparative?
Which literatures?
Which literatures, yes. At Chapel Hill, I went to the University of North Carolina. My coursework was in English. I mean, as far as the languages were concerned, it was English, German, and French. There were complete courses and classics courses. And my dissertation and my master's was Hungarian, comparing for the master's just with German, and for the PhD with German and French. Hungarian literature with them. So my advisor and the head of the department was a Swiss professor, Friedrich, and he was cutting edge, one of the early complete people, one of the first people in the US to do complete. And when I first went in to speak with him, he said, now I hope you're going to be using your Hungarian language background and doing something in Hungarian literature, which is, of course, what I wanted to do. And it was very gratifying not to have to convince someone that, yes, I can take my courses as you prescribe, but I'm still going to write my dissertation the way I want to write it. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
What was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on Imre Madach's Tragedy of Man as a philosophical poem, with comparisons with Milton's Paradise Lost and some of Shelley's works and some French, not quite as major works, but similar philosophical poems. And actually, my dissertation advisor had me include Tiger, who was his lamb, I think, yes.
What happened after graduate school?
After graduate school, I had a job at the University of Maryland. I was an instructor there. I was still working on my dissertation, and I took off some time because I had a heavy course load at Maryland, and I wasn't advancing in writing it. And then I couldn't go back to Maryland because they were cutting back on staff, but I did get a job at Dunbarton College. which was very nice, except the school closed about 2 or 3 years later. And then I taught at American University and Hood College, but those were part-time. And then the Library of Congress was looking for someone with language background, and I went there and worked there for 30 years. A very good place to work. I could do my research. I had access to all the books. Actually, I did much of my master's and PhD research at the Library of Congress, which is a fantastic collection in both Hungarian literature and history, and other areas too, but these were my areas. And retired from the Library of Congress.
How did the American Hungarian Educators Association come about?
Right, well, there is this Hungarian meeting in Cleveland every year, and we went there with my husband and my parents, and they had asked for, as part of the call for papers, for someone to give a talk on how to translate or bring in some of the younger people to Hungarian studies, and especially in terms of teaching, not so much elementary, but university level teaching. So at that time there were actually quite a few people, relatively, who had the same background as I and were teaching at various universities in the United States and Canada. And so how can we involve these in some sort of way to make sure that they have the ability and the resources to pass on Hungarian heritage? And so I gave a talk, and there were 12 people there, my husband and myself and 10 more, and we said, well, we should form an organization. So we got together, not right then, but a little later, got together, drew up a constitution, bylaws, started to recruit. The next year we had a conference, and from then on we have a conference every year, and it just grew out of that. And of course our membership is grown and is quite different, and we have lots of people come from Hungary and Transylvania and other parts to the conferences, and our communications have become so much easier in the digital age.
What year did you found the AHEA?
That was 1974. Yeah. So it's been almost 50 years now.
So it sounds like founding the AHEA brought together a lot of different strains in your background.
I guess so. It's not something I thought about, but it just seemed like a good idea, and I was very lucky that there were people who shared my ideas. And we were all together because of this Hungarian group, Hungarian Congress, I think they call it. I was thinking of the Hungarian name, Hungarian Congress. So there were a couple of people there who could join, and we could make it something that was more than just a talk that was heard and that was it. Because if we hadn't had the other people join, there could have been no continuation. And then, of course, I got in touch with people I could contact. I went through some names I think, Foreign Language Association, roster, and so on, with Hungarian names, and wrote to them. And the others did the same, and they spread it among their friends. So, I mean, it grew slowly, but it grew.
Did you ever think about going back to your...
Well, I have gone back to visit, obviously, many times. I went back in 1966 the first time, 66. And then it was 76 for a International Comparative Literature Association meeting. And of course, I also visited friends. I mean, you don't go for... And since then I've been back, or we have been back several times. And but as far as settling back, no, I didn't think of that. We didn't think of that. More it's this is what we're used to. What's next? Well, I'm now retired. I'm over 80. I'm not too ambitious. I did have a Kluge Fellowship at the Library of Congress, and I started what I hope to turn into a book, but I'm not sure it's going to happen anymore. But I did have a year as a scholar in residence at the Library of Congress, and I was still working there, but this was not my regular job, but I had the whole year just to do research. And I presented a paper on Hungarian poets. This was the theme, the purpose of the study. Hungarian poets as spokesmen for the nation, particularly in times when politicians couldn't be the spokesman for the nation. Under Austrians, for the most part, and so, or various parts of Hungarian history, of course. I had hoped to turn it into a book, but I'm afraid I'm not sure it's going to happen. It might or it might not. We'll see.
What about during the pandemic? What happened?
Okay. By that time, I had retired as executive director of AHEA, and of course I had all this material, and I took that opportunity to collect all the archival material and sent it up to the Hungarian American Foundation. As the logical place for archival material to be kept. I obviously wasn't going to keep it, and there would be a time when it would disappear when I'm dead or incapacitated. And to have that passed on to each president is not feasible. So that was the repository for our archives. So, and I think it is a repository for archives, and getting rid of them would mean getting rid of Hungarian American history.
So you're an expert in immigration matters.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but I had Yolanda Pushka's book, and there's a Vasari collection in Szeged, and I mean, I to some extent experience, and there were other sources I used. I mean, I have books back home on all these things. Hungarica, I mean, immigration, all kinds of newspaper articles and all kinds of things of Hungarians in the United States from Kossuth's visit to the most recent times.
Okay, that's Vasari.
So Vasari, and he left that collection to the Somogy Library in Szeged.
Is it mostly in Hungarian?
Mostly English.
Mostly in English. Okay.
Well, what he collected here in terms of, there's probably some Hungarian material in it, but if a newspaper had an article on Hungarians or on Kossuth's visit or Hungarian immigrants at various times he was here, came as a young man and died here at 90 or something. I mean, a lifespan of collecting.
And that other source, Pushka? What did you say that
Let's
was?
see, I think it's Ilona. But Professor Pushka, she wrote several books on Hungarian immigrants to the U.S. and Hungarian immigration to the U.S. But very many Scandinavian students, and I think it was Norway or Sweden, I think it was Norway, and they said, there's no point in us having a medical school, we'll just send them to Debrecen or elsewhere in Europe. But there were, the residence hall I was in, there was a computer room downstairs with all kinds of laptops, well, not laptops, but
It was a cluster, computer cluster.
Well, that's what. Before laptops, they were desktops. Desktops, and the keyboard were set to the Scandinavian languages. It was fun. And
So you taught in Debrecen.
I taught in Debrecen too.
What did you teach there?
North American libraries.
It was for librarianship?
It was in the School of Library Studies, yes.
Okay.
It was a special seminar. People could elect it. It would be nice if university education wasn't as expensive as it is. Although I worked at the Library of Congress for 30 years, I'm not a librarian, so I'm not going to comment on that. I think the library was a great place to work. It has changed with a new librarian who came a couple of years ago from a public library background, but it's, change is always positive, or can be. Yeah. So I don't know. I would. I'm not going to get into politics by any means. Well, let me see. I'm getting ready to give a paper at the Modern Language Association, which I will continue to do and continue active in the AHEA, and organize my papers, and I will probably continue giving papers. Might even write a book. As far as the AHEA is concerned, I think what's important is that it is interdisciplinary, and we have literature, history, arts, sciences, dance, sociology, everything, all kinds of disciplines represented, which on their own probably wouldn't be able to maintain an association because there aren't enough people working in the field, but collectively we can do it.